Okay, it's not advancing. One second, technical difficulties, my slide's not advancing. All right, so our objectives today are like I sort of said, describing the purpose of the regulatory binder, the best practices when maintaining a regulatory binder, and identifying essential documents within the regulatory binder. Disclaimers, I have no financial or other relevant interest to the subject matter. Also, this presentation is not to be deemed all-inclusive of everything you need for a regulatory binder, but I did try to include as many things as I could think of. And I really do want this presentation to be interactive with our audience. So when you see some things and you have other comments or things to add to it or whatever, please share it with us so that we can, by the end of the presentation, hopefully we can have an all-inclusive oversight of what the regulatory binder needs and what how we need to maintain it. So what is a regulatory binder? It can be electronic, it can be paper, it can be a combination of both. A file, and basically it contains our study-specific information and essential documents and regulatory documents. There was about 10 years ago or so, there was a really big push for all of our regulatory binders, our regulatory documents, everything to be electronic. Well, we tried that, and then the monitors would come in and they wanted everything in paper. So basically, we know all the information we need to keep in the regulatory binder. No one can really tell us how to do that, as long as when someone comes in, whether it's the FDA, the sponsor, our institutional regulatory personnel come in, as long as we can show them the documents and the information that they're wanting, really no one can tell us, because there's really not a regulation or a guidance that says exactly how you have to maintain these documents. So there's a few purposes of the regulatory binder. One is compliance, so that we show compliance with the FDA regulations, the ICH-GCPs, our institutional SOPs, those kind of things. And also it validates adherence that we are maintaining high standards when we conduct our research. Also, record keeping. It provides an organizational framework for our essential documents, and also we want to keep it organized, and we want to have it in a way that anyone that's allowed to come in and look at our documents, that they can come in and easily access them and evaluate how we're conducting our clinical trials. So what are some other names of the regulatory binder? Like I'm known as Dorita, D, Mom, Grams, whatever. What's some other names that we use for the regulatory binder? And those of you that are on Zoom, please unmute yourself if you would like to comment and give us your thoughts, please. But what are some other names that we call the regulatory binder?
Investigator site file.
Investigator site file. Anybody else? Lots of different names. All means the same thing. So here's some regulatory binder, reg binder, investigator binder, investigator site file, like Misha said, study binder, master trial file, study administrative binder, regulatory file, study file, trial master file. There's a lot of different things, but it all means the same thing. It just depends on who you're talking to. You have to sort of learn that lingo. If your sponsor, your monitor calls it one thing, then you know that's pretty much how we go by that, or your institution. So how do we label what information should be included on the reg binder? So we know what which regulatory binder, or I call it reg binder just for short because I'm a little bit, I guess, lazy, but what information should be included in the labeling of the reg binder?
Protocol number, the number of binders attached to it, like binder 1 or 2, or
right. Okay. Maybe if it's a sponsor trial, maybe sponsor information like who's the sponsor, your PI. That's one of the things.
Sections.
Sections. So what some of the main things that you really need to, like we just said, is the title, number of binders if there's more than one, the PI name, protocol name, or identifier. Like if it's like, you know, it might be the whole protocol name, or it could just be protocol number, whatever. Your IRB number sometimes is a good thing to put on there. And then if you do have a sponsor, put that information on there, or a CRO or whatever's, whoever is responsible in sponsoring that particular trial. So whose responsibility is it to maintain the regulatory binder?
Everybody involved in the study, really.
Okay, exactly. So it involves a lot of different team members, study team members, key study personnel, but ultimately everything is the responsibility of the PI, exactly. But it could include investigators, coordinators, research associates or assistants, data managers, regulatory staff. Just anybody that's involved in the study can be an active member of including documents into the regulatory binder. If you are the clinical research coordinator, though, I take as a coordinator, I took a little bit more responsibility. Yes, ultimately it's the PI's responsibility, but me as a primary coordinator, I would ensure that if these other study staff or key site personnel had something to add, that I would make sure that that did get added. All right, so what are some best practices? When we talk about best practices with the reg binder, we want to talk about what's the best practice for maintenance, for organization, and for storage. So for maintenance, what are some things? How do you maintain the regulatory binder? What's the best way to maintain it?
Keeping it updated with current.
Exactly. So come on in. No, you're fine. So maintenance, establish the regulatory binder at the beginning of the study. Even if you're doing a sponsor trial, and we know our sponsors usually provide that regulatory binder for us, go on and start. If you don't have that regulatory binder at the beginning, then go on and start just a notebook and keep things that are coming in until you get that official regulatory binder from a sponsor. Keep it, as you said, keep it current, up to date, and organized. You want certain documents, if it's subject-specific documents, then those a lot of times are maintained separately from the reg binder in a different notebook or binder. And you do not want to destroy any previous versions or any essential documents if you're replacing them with a newer version. And talking about if you do, well, I think I covered that in storage in just a minute. Hold on a second. So organization, you want to store items in your regulatory binder in a reverse chronological order. You want the newest information on top because it'll be the easiest for you to be able to find it. You want to customize the binder, as we talked about a minute ago, to your specific protocol. All the things we're going to talk about today do not necessarily have to go in every single regulatory binder. You need to make it specific to your protocol. And also, you want to file sections. You can organize it any way you want to, but one of the best ways to do it is file some sections that you use the most at the beginning of your binder. That way it's easy to find. Instead of maybe your current protocol being in the middle of it and you have to find it every time, or your current informed consent every time you want to consent someone, maybe you want to put that toward the front, okay? Go away at the bottom. It's messing me up. So storage. Store the binder in a safe and secure location at the investigator site, and you want it only to be accessed or be accessible.
Minimize it right at the, there you go, right at the top. They can't see that outside of this room. You can just move it down too. You can just grab the whole thing and move it down.
But you want to store it in a safe and secure location that only Daniel, stop.
Not here.
That only people that need to have access to it can get access to it, okay?
Right there.
That's okay, just stop. Documents not stored in the regulatory binder need a note to file or a memo stating where they are. So when we get into a little bit farther along the presentation, we talk about some of the different kinds of documents that I feel like I usually keep outside of the original reg binder. And so whenever you do, you have a tab for that. Say maybe it's the delegation of authority log. And so you have a tab for that. So you would just insert a note to file in there that says that it's separate, it's kept separate, and it's maintained by a certain person, okay? You want to maintain subject confidentiality, and it's also suggested that certain things like I just alluded to is to maintain outside of the regulatory binder, like signed informed consents, test results, completed case report forms. Maybe it doesn't have to be, but maybe like your screening enrollment log, your master log, your contracts, your budgets, those kind of things. A lot of times we recommend that those are kept outside of the regulatory binder, but you would still within the regulatory binder have those tabs. So you would need a note to file to say where those additional documents are maintained and by whom. So these are some of the tabs that we're going to talk about today. And as you see, I tried to cover most of the things that you would have a tab for in an industry sponsor type clinical trial. So one of the things that I tried to do with my regulatory binders, and a lot of this stuff is just suggestions, but I always put my current protocol first in my regulatory binder, because that's what or maybe even you keep it in your regulatory binder, you might even want a separate little notebook with it, because that's one of the documents that you're going to go to and reference a lot. You're going to have questions, you're going to go back to your protocol, you're going to see exactly what that protocol says. You also, with the current protocol, you want the PI signature page signed. And why does the PI need to sign this page? What's the importance of that?
It shows oversight that they've looked at the protocol, they know they're aware of the current protocol.
Right. They're basically saying, I understand it, I agree with it, and I'm going to conduct this study according to this protocol. It doesn't always happen like that. That's the way it's supposed to. And that's why the protocol signature page is there, to show that they've read it, they understand it, and they agree that they're going to follow it. Also, in this first section, I would put, like, if this was a revision or amendment to the protocol, I would put that summary of changes there too. So I would know from, maybe I had a subject that started a year ago and they added some procedures. Well, that particular subject wouldn't have to have all of those procedures, like say their first visit or something like that. So that would sort of help me know that when the changes happened and when they took place and which subjects needed to follow this particular amendments. My next section usually was the current informed consent. So if you have a study where you have multiple informed consents, how do you ensure that the most updated consent is used? How do you track all that? Give me some, there's no right or wrong answer, y'all. It's just what you do in your practice.
Printed off the IRB website.
That's what I do.
Okay.
One that says approved out there, that way.
Okay, your current approved one off the IRB website. Anybody else do anything different? No? Okay. We used to have, if we had a study where we had a lot of enrollments, anticipating a lot of enrollments, like hundreds of subjects, we would keep like some little folders like with the current ICF. So you always had to go back and remember if you had a revised one, then go back and change those out or whatever. Probably the safest is what you were saying. You go to the IRB website and you print it off. It depends on your study, because if you have a really high enrolling study, then that might not be quite so convenient. Like, you know, maybe you're in clinic and they've got 5 people all of a sudden, you know, you don't have the access to go in and print it, versus if you have a clinic study and you know only 1 patient's coming in today that possibly could qualify, then you take that 1 or 2 if you know, have an extra one or whatever, just in case. Take that consent with you. So there's different ways to do it. You just have to ensure that you're using the most current informed consent. So once we do have signed consent forms, where do you usually maintain those signed consent forms? Because that could be a tab in your regulatory binder, but do you always keep them in the regulatory binder? Yeah.
It's too much.
Right. It depends on your study. You're right. It depends on your study. Most of the time, it's just too much to maintain in the reg binder. So you're going to keep it outside of the regulatory binder. You might have a separate binder that you just keep all signed informed consents in, or you might keep signed consent forms in that subject's like study documents or whatever. Because we would keep a folder for each study participant, or it just depends again on the study. But if you have a tab that says signed informed consents, again, put your note to follow in there and say they're being kept separately in the patient study binder document, whatever you know call it, or in a separate notebook. And if you're keeping it in a separate notebook, then like we did the regulatory binder, then label that notebook with some of the same information and say signed informed consent. So in your note to file, you're going to put all that information in there where those documents are being stored. So the next section that I usually would put, the third section would be the institutional review board section. And this section is, the purpose is to document what you have submitted to the IRB, what's been approved by the IRB, and it also can help identify like the current versions of the informed consent, of your advertisement, of your protocol, things like that. Again, this is another section, the IRB section, for most of my studies that were sponsored by industry, that's really fat. So I would usually have an IRB binder in addition to my regulatory binder. It just depends on your study. If you only put in 1 submission, you're not going to have revisions, you're not going to have those kind of things, then maybe you can keep it within your original reg binder. But for mine, I usually had 2 or 3 IRB binders that went with the regulatory binder. So what are some of the documents that we maintain in the regulatory binder?
Outcome letter.
Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah, the outcome letters, protocol, the other ones.
All the submissions.
Right. So basically, it's all your submissions, whether it's initial, it's ongoing, it's continuing, it's amendments, it's your termination, those kind of things. And you want to make sure that you include all versions of the protocol with the signature page, your informed consent, your recruitment materials. Also, most IRBs now are asking for blank case report forms because they want to know what data you're collecting. That depends on your IRB, but I know most of the time the UT-HSC here IRB is requesting that information. If you have informational materials that you're going to give the subject, those are some things that would be in there with your IRB submission. Reportable events. If you have a sponsored trial that has a DSMB, those reports would be in there. Also, your submissions to the IRB showing that you had submitted the DSMB reports also. And any correspondence you could add to the IRB, like if it's proviso letters, your responses, things like that.
Quick question. So, because I don't know the current IRB thing for UT-HSC, but one of the reasons to have either this electronically or in hard copy is because they only keep this in iMedris for how long?
Right now, I asked Cameron just to get a clarification because I was told that the IRB only has to keep it in iMedris for 3 years. Right now, iMedris UTHSC iMeasures is keeping it in there forever for right now. But that's a great question, because when I did some audits at Le Bonheur, there was one study that I had 2 outcome letters that I could not find. So I went to the IRB to get those outcome letters. The IRB couldn't find them, and neither could the iMeasures system. So my recommendation is you keep all of your IRB documents outside of iMeasures, just in case. I mean, you don't have to keep it in paper if you don't want to. You have a file and keep it electronic. So as soon as they send you that outcome letter or whatever, just put it over into your, folder, and keep it so you not have 5 binders worth of paper documents or whatever if you don't want to. So correspondence with the IRB includes approval letters, proviso letters, PI responses, IRB notices of upcoming expiration dates. If you had an IRB letter and you needed a correction of that letter because something in it was not correct, which rarely happens, but it does happen, you would want to put that in there. Your IRB stamped all your documents, things like that. Also, something important that I know some people don't do from when I was auditing is you need your IRB membership roster. And you need it from the date that your study started to the end of your study. So you can't just do it a one-time thing. Well, I'll take it back. If your study is more than a year or so ongoing, you can't just do the roster one time or the membership one time. You have to do it throughout the life of the study, because those memberships can change. And even if they don't change, if you have an FDA auditor or someone come in, they want to see that it didn't change year after year after year. So you need to keep that. And probably you need to keep it for here at UTHSC, you probably need to keep it for all 4 boards, because your study might go in and get approved under one board, but if it goes for an ongoing review or an amendment or something, it could be one of the other boards that sees it that time. And so it's probably just easier on the front end just to keep a membership roster of all 4 boards, and then you don't have to worry about which one it went under or not went under. The other thing, the last thing for in the IRB section to maintain is your IRB FWA, which can be found on the UTHSC website, IRB website, and I'm sure on other, especially if you're using the central IRBs that have that information out there. And I'm sure that other, like UNMC, I'm sure their IRB also has that information that's readily available on their website.
What's FWA?
The Federal Wide Assurance Number. And that just assures that the IRB is doing what they're supposed to do and follow the OHSP regulations, things like that. And that's more for your sponsor trials. If you're doing a PI initiated type trial, then you probably wouldn't necessarily need that unless you're going to use that information as a pilot study that you're going to use later on that might go for an industry sponsored or NIH trial or something like that. So what are some tips, those of you that maintain regulatory binders, which I'm sure it's everybody, what are some tips that you can give on how you organize or how you maintain this section? Because it can be this section can be very cumbersome. It can be very cumbersome. I mean, I've had lots of studies where I might, like I said, have 2 or 3 binders just of IRB. Of course, I kept everything in paper. That's old school, but so you don't have to do that. But so some of the things that I like to do was I would take whatever I submitted, say that we'll start with an initial submission, okay? Whatever I submitted, I would clip it all together, and I would come back when I got my approval letter or my proviso letters or whatever, and I put everything together and put it in that section together. And I even sometimes would make a title page for that, like initial submission, and put what date I submitted it, what date I approved, what date it got approved. Just trying to get it as much organized as I possibly could so that anybody coming behind me could easily figure out what happened, okay? So every submission I would do that. If I had a revision, I might even put on that revision like what was revised, or you put your approval letter on the top of what you submitted. And usually for us, I know usually our IRB approval letters on our revisions will tell us what was revised, if it was adding personnel or if it was adding a revised protocol or whatever the case may be. And that's what I was alluding to at the bottom, like the summary of changes or whatever. Do y'all have any, is there any other way that some of you organize it to, or you just put it by dates, like in chronological order or whatever? I mean, any way is fine as long as you know your system. And if someone is looking for something, a monitor or auditor or whatever can come in and you can find it for them, that's fine. I just tried to organize it a little bit where everything that went with that approval letter was all together and clipped, and it made it much easier for myself and coordinators to find the things that we needed to find. So the next section we're going to talk about is the study team credentials. So what all do we have to keep as part of study team credentials?
Current CVs, then their financial statement.
License, financial statement,
City training.
all the different kinds of training that they need. So your CVs, your resume, bio sketch, whichever that person may have, for every key site personnel that's involved in the study, whether it's your investigator, your subs, your coordinators, your data managers, whoever has a significant impact on the data for the study. Your financial disclosure forms, even a lot of industry sponsored studies now are asking for conflict of interest forms. So that might be something that you keep in this section. Like for a nurse, or if you have dental or medical like certifications or pharmacy certifications or license, any of those things that you need to show that you're qualified by education, training, or experience to do your job for that study, then that's what you need to include in that area. And then we talked about training documents, which we'll talk about in a second, because I usually kept more specific training documents in a different area for the protocol. So, but in here you could keep like your general stuff, like your human subject protection, your GCP, things like that. So on the study team credentials, do you maintain them like in your reg binder, or do you have it in a separate file or
Separate binder.
separate
And we have
binder?
a sheet in the regulatory binder that says C binder.
Perfect. Okay. Did you have?
I had mine all together.
Okay. For all your studies, you have all the for each study. That's how I did it too. But a lot of people, for like people that are, say you're in neurology and you have 10 doctors and you have 10 coordinators or whatever, they would keep everything in one binder for everybody and they would update it. There's nothing wrong with that. The only, well, I guess that's that's probably not appropriate when I say there's nothing wrong with it, and then I say but anyway, there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing you have to consider if you do keep all of it for all studies in one place is that at the end of the study, you have to pull that information out for each particular study and store it with that particular study. Do you see, did that make sense? Does that make sense on that? Because when you store your study documents, essential documents at the end of that study, at the termination of that study, all those credentials for that particular study has to be stored with that study. So if you're keeping them all together, it sort of could become cumbersome to go back in and figure out which ones you need and which dates you need for that particular study and things like that. So I think the way that a couple of us have said, it's better to maintain it like per study. Even if you keep it electronically, that's fine, but per study, so then you can just pull that out and store it with your documents at the end of that particular study. And that's what the second one was talking
I
about.
do have one thing. We did that at the Bonner briefly, where we tried to maintain a record of everyone's CVs because you have to update them at a certain time and creating an alert system.
Right.
So it is all in one location, and you know that your note to file will say this is whatever, but we know that that CV's been updated.
Right.
So instead of having to update it in every single binder,
Right.
we had one location, and then so what you're saying at the end, you store exactly what you need at that time.
Right, because you don't want to include, if like you have everybody, say you have 10 people that really didn't, was not involved in that particular study, you don't want to store their stuff with that particular study. So you have to pull out that information for that study, which is fine. You just have to think about it. It could become really cumbersome at the end when you're trying to store things.
So would you want to store every single CV during the duration of the study or the most current one?
You have to show, and maybe that's in the next slide. You have to show anybody that's involved in the study, you have to show that they are qualified from the beginning of the study throughout their participation in the study. So most of the time, and some studies even require you to store their information like financial disclosure and conflict of interest and stuff for 2 years after the end of the trial. But that's specific for your industry-sponsored studies.
And we can store it electronically.
You can.
Okay.
You just have to pull it off. The only thing I'll say about that is I've been doing research for like 25 years, and we used to keep documents on floppy disks. Some of y'all probably don't even know what that is. You're too young, but we kept things on floppy disk. And I would have like correspondence and things like that, like my emails, and I just put them on a floppy disk and I'd store it with the study documents at the end of the trial. Well, I'm sure those studies now you can't even access a floppy disk. So in 20 more years, can we access some of the ways that we're stored electronically? I don't know. If you're doing a trial that has a European influence in it, those trials are asking us to keep our study documents for 25 years.
Really?
So, yes. That's why it's really important, y'all. I'm going to backtrack for a second. But it's really important as a coordinator or a PI or whoever, you read the protocol frontwards and backwards, because in that protocol, it's going to tell you those kind of things. And the European ones are telling you, and it's not that it's just a European study, but if it has any European like sponsorship or any kind of even subjects and stuff, a lot of them are telling you to keep those documents for 25 years. So make sure you read those protocols, because it'll sort of outline some of those things.
Canada is the same.
Ma'am?
Canada is the same.
Oh, is it Canada? Okay.
We have 30 use.
Oh, wow. Oh my goodness, that's even worse. we don't, maybe we won't do any of those studies around here. Yes.
What about like a multi-centered study, like for the NIH? Do you, as coordinator, do you have to have for all of the other centers, or are they're responsible for their own?
Right. You're just
Okay.
responsible for your site.
Okay.
Unless you're the coordinating center. And if you're the coordinating center, then read your protocols and talk to your PI and stuff like that, because sometimes you do have to maintain going back to that master file, which is different from your regulatory file.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? So just go back and look, because if you're the coordinating center, you might have to keep up with everybody's. Or maybe it depends on your protocol. Maybe you just need to collect that information at the end of the trial, or make sure throughout the study that they're maintaining it in a current, up-to-date fashion. You see what I'm saying?
Trust them.
Then you better be doing it yourself. So the second bullet was that your key site personnel credentials should be maintained at the time, or like at the beginning, right before they start their participation, throughout the end of their participation in the study. Your CVs, most of the time, if you're doing a sponsored trial, you want your CVs or your resumes to be signed and dated. They can sometimes, like FDA or NIH, might be forgiven if the CV or the resume has like a preparation date, so it shows that it's current. And all of that is just because, again, you go back to every key site personnel needs to be qualified by education, training, or experience. And that's what these credentials show that they are. and that they're up to date. The other thing, the last bullet, is that industry standard is that you update your CVs or resume like every 2 years. And again, that just shows that you're current, that you're qualified. There's not a regulation for that, but it is industry standard that you do that every 2 years. Okay, so let's get to training documents. Lots of documents. We have some of our basic that we should have, like human subject protection, your ICH-GCPs, your federal regulations, your common rule, your Declaration of Helsinki, Nuremberg, Belmont, and some of that comes if you do your city training on your HSP, then your Declaration of Helsinki, Nuremberg, Belmont, all those things, are included in that. You might have institutional specific training. You need to make sure that you document training of your protocol, any specific procedures, investigational product, things like that. If you have in-services for research or for your particular study, you need to include those kind of things. Any kind of meetings like your SIV, those kind of meetings from the sponsor. If you have where you're shipping specimens, you need IDA training or your maybe biohazard, which probably your institution, or you can do the IDA training online. You might have SOP or MOPs. That could be like our IRBs have SOPs, or you might have institutional or departmental SOPs that you need to follow, that you need to show documentation of training of those. Any other things you can think of that you need training for? The main thing with the training documents is we probably all have the training that we need, but we don't do a very good job of documenting it. So just make sure that you document this training. A lot of your industry-sponsored trials, and I know I keep harping on that, but those are the most strict usually trials. A lot of them are saying now that we will follow the Declaration of Helsinki, so you really want to make sure that you show that people have read the Declaration of Helsinki and they have training in it to know what it says, specifically for that out of the city training of the HSP. All right, one thing I believe personally that every study needs is a delegation log. Delegation of responsibility, delegation of authority, whatever you might want to title it. Here are some of the other names. I just learned this week. I know this is so stupid, but I always call it the DOA, the delegation of authority, which everybody thinks of that dead on arrival. So this week when I was doing some research for this, it's like somebody had delegation of authority log, and I thought, oh, that's so much better than me calling it a DOA. So now I'm going to call it the DOAL. So I don't have to, because I'll say DOA, and people are like, what are you talking about? So anyway, so there's my delegation of authority, but I'm going to switch. And delegation of responsibility, a long time ago, and maybe still now, those of you in the room can't see, but a lot of people call it the signature log, because it sort of matched up the signature, the initials, things like that. So there's lots of different names, but the main thing is that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. What are some of the main purposes of the DOAL? What does the DOAL tell us? What does it help us to for our study? And this is a section that you really need in your binder.
Who key study personnel are and what their responsibilities are.
Exactly, what their tasks are. It identifies who they are, what their tasks are. It also does their handwriting to like their initials. So if you're documenting, you just put your initial, then you can go back and just tell who did that. It also ensures that the key site personnel, the principal investigator, has assigned them those duties and that they're qualified to perform those duties. And it also documents should document a timeline for that particular key site personnel's participation in the study. So you should have a start date and an end date. So those are some of the things that this particular document. Does everybody feel like you need a declaration, a DOA? Okay. I personally do. I know there are some studies, maybe your PI initiated studies, maybe that some people don't feel like they need one. I personally would not do a study without one because it covers me. It tells me exactly what my tasks are, what I'm responsible for. And if I'm only responsible for, say, the IRB submissions, then that's what it's gonna say. And it wouldn't say I'm a coordinator, because then I would have a lot other different responsibilities. So it really does sort of cover you. So I personally feel, that's just my personal belief, that you need a DOA, DOAL, whatever, for every study to identify who is responsible for what. So in order to, our best practices for this particular form is to document currently. Keep it up to date at all times. We talked about the timeline for it. The PI has to initial and date like any changes, like they'll initial and date at the beginning of when the whenever the key site personnel are enrolled or added to the log. And also they have to sign at the end of the study to show that they agree and that all those tasks were relevant and that they were assigned appropriately. So just make sure, say, here's a for instance. You start out as a coordinator on the study and you have March to October, but then something happens and you are just going to be in charge of the IRB submissions. So there's different ways that you can do that. You can just end your participation or your task as a coordinator and resubmit or re-add you down at the bottom as like just a regulatory person. But that PI needs to initial that change happened, okay? So there's different ways, or you could, if you have a delegation of authority log where you have all your tasks like written out in numbers, which a lot of them do, then you could just cross out the one for coordinator or whatever, or whatever task that you were performing as coordinator, and let that PI initial each one of those, that you're not doing those, and date, what date you're not doing it. But it's really cleaner just to stop your participation as coordinator and put a new task down at the bottom. So another section is your participant, your subject or participant logs. And this is logs that tell us who we talked to about the study, who we screened, and who we enrolled. Are there any other names that y'all call? Like, I put together the screening and enrollment log on one log, and then a master log, which identifies the subject to like the subject number, the identifier. So it matches my patient to my subject. Are there any other names? Do y'all use any other kind of logs that you use that you call? I mean, it's probably the same thing. You just might call it a different. Or do you combine the screening and enrollment, or do you have two separate ones?
We have two separate.
Okay.
A screening, because there's so many that we go through screening. So it just makes it easier to find it.
Right. And it's whatever works for your study. This whole presentation is whatever works for your particular study. But so you can have a separate screening, and then an enrollment. Which is your enrollment considered your master log, or do you have a master log also?
That's our master.
Okay. So your enrollment identifies the subject to the participant. Okay. All right. So the main thing with these, do you keep that in your regulatory binder? Right. I never kept mine. I always kept mine separate because you're always updating it and different things. So that's another one of those things. You organize it whatever is best for you, but we kept those logs separate also. Again, in your tab for that, put where it's maintained, who it's maintained by, things like that. And those particular logs, you want them locked up, or you want them where no one else has access to it except for the few people that need access to them, especially your master log that has it probably has some patient identifier information as far as demographics, things like that, that you don't want it just out in the open or whatever. So you have to really make sure that those documents are secure. Anybody else have any comments on that? So here, I think we've covered most of this, but it captures patients that have been approached, screened, or a combination of these, whether you keep it separate or not. It tells us who we've talked to, who we screened, and if they have a desire to participate, and if they meet initial eligibility or whatever. Also, it provides a comprehensive list of everybody that we talked to. I have audited some studies that they really don't keep a very accurate screening enrollment log, but everybody that we approach, we need to write down by initial. You don't put any identifier, but by initial that we talked to that person about the particular study. We want to document it in chronological order of like when we screened or when we enrolled, things like that. So some of the best practices is, again, like you said, keep everything up to date. Because if you're someone like Barbara and you're screening like maybe 10 a day or something, it's really hard to get, easy to get behind. So you want to make sure that you have maybe that screening log with you, like as you're going and talking, so you can easily just jot everything down. Because once you get back to your desk, like 5 hours later, you might not remember all the people that you actually talked to. The actual screening log should not have any identifier information, but your master log or your enrollment log could. And you want to make sure you number each page, like you said earlier about the binder, 1 of 2, 1 of 3, 2 or 3, whatever the case may be. And then at the end, you want to say that it's the final page so you know where you stop. And that goes again, like when you're storing those documents, so that everybody knows that's the end of those particular logs. So just hit a little bit on the master log. That's the subjects that have been enrolled in the study. And it does have the contact information, so make sure you keep that confidential.
Great. So should we break for a few minutes? I don't know, you're halfway. This might be a good point. People need to refresh water. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
Are y'all good? Are y'all good? Just me, I'm sweating to death. But case report forms is another tab. So the purpose of this case report form is it shows what required information is needed for the study, and it's for data collection and entry. This is one thing that a lot of times is missing from the regulatory documents is blank case report forms. You need to keep a blank copy of these. The case report forms might include data collection sheets, your questionnaires, worksheets, whatever the case may be. But you should maintain it in the regulatory binder, or if you want to keep it outside, again, in the tab, tell where you're maintaining it or whatever. It could be if you're keeping it in the IRB section because you're already having to send it. A lot of people are already having to send it to the IRB. You could just say it's maintained in your initial submission documents to the IRB or something like that, so you don't have to duplicate maintenance of some of these forms. We have enough documents to have to keep up with. We don't want to duplicate efforts. So wherever you can cut corners.
I have a question. Some of the data collection sheets are my internal data collection sheets. Does every single data collection sheet need to be submitted to the IRB?
That depends on the study, but right now, if it's data collected for the study, here at UT, and you'll have to clarify with them, but my understanding is they want to see all of the data you're collecting for that particular study. And the reason for that is because so many people say, or not, I shouldn't say that, but some people say, oh, I'm not collecting PHI. But then their case report forms are collecting PHI. And so that's why they started asking for those documents to ensure that they're, collecting what they say they're collecting.
And most of them I do submit, but there are some of them that I keep on constantly updating and changing, and those are my internal data
Yeah.
collections.
If it's something specific for that study, I think the IRB wants to see it, but that's a question directly for your IRB to talk to one of the analysts or whatever and ask. If you're submitting and they're not asking for it, I wouldn't open that can of worms personally. But you want to make sure if you're saying you're not collecting PHI and you really are, you really want to be, upfront and let them know, because I mean, it's okay to collect PHI, but you gotta let them know that. So completed case report forms, whether it's a questionnaire or it's actually a 5-page, case report form where you're collecting all this demographic and all that stuff. Where do you usually store those?
Subject binder.
Exactly. That's exactly where I usually did. I would keep it in a subject binder separate. If you have a small study, you possibly could keep it in your reg binder. If you just have a 1-page questionnaire that you're asking or something like that, as long as it didn't, probably I might need to take that back because it might have some demographic information on it that you don't want to keep in the reg binder. But we usually stored ours with the subject binders too. Just let them know.
Do you prefer, like from a monitoring standpoint too, because you've done that for a long time, do you prefer, say that there's a pre and post survey, do you prefer that all the pre-surveys are together and all the post-surveys are together, or do you prefer that those are pre and post are kept for each subject?
I don't, whenever I do audits, I can't tell you how to maintain it. I can just tell you if I need to see it, you need to easily find it for me. And I think that's how most monitors are. Now, some monitors prefer it a certain way, and once you've worked with that monitor, you know their routine. It's best to keep it the way they want it because it's easier for them to find things. And that's a happy monitors, like you were talking about. And you want to keep your monitors happy or your auditors happy or whatever. So I really never really cared, as long as it was sort of organized, that I could find things that I needed, or if I couldn't, I could go to that coordinator or that key site personnel and say, hey, I can't find this particular document, where is it? And they could readily find it for me. I like things to be organized, like you said, I like things to be organized, but I can't tell you have to keep it a certain way, or no auditor or monitor can tell you. They can try, but they can't mandate that. But again, if they ask you to do certain things and you keep it that way and get their particular routine, it just makes their audit visits and stuff go a lot smoother. So most case report forms, whether it's like your electronic data capturing system that a lot of your sponsor trials have now, or if it's paper form, somehow you've got to like date and sign off that you completed those forms. And also the other thing is, and you have a handout, and those of you that are on the Zoom call, we will send this handout to you too, the Alcoa C. You want to make sure that you follow that, which is that everything has to be attributable, meaning you have to know who created it, who wrote it, all those kind of things. Legible, contemporaneous, which we've talked about throughout this presentation about being up to date and current. And also recently they've added the C. It used to be just Alcoa, but the C is for complete. So I don't really know the difference too much between accurate and complete, but they added that. So maybe some of y'all can help me out on that one. The other thing is that your case report forms, the information that you put on the case report form should be consistent with your source doc, and you should have a source doc for everything that you enter in your on your case report form, whether it's electronic or paper. And changes or corrections to your case report form should be dated, initialed, and should not obscure the original entry. So you want to do the single line, initial date. You know, if it's something that needs an explanation, you need to put an explanation of why that entry was incorrect. And usually on most of your case report forms, your PIs will review and sign off on it, especially your electronic data capturing systems. Usually the PI has to go in and sign off on that. If not, on your sponsor, on your paper case report forms, usually they'll ask for your PI, to sign and date those case report forms once you've completed them. And that's just to show that they agree to the information that you've added, that it's accurate, or entered that it's accurate. So I put this in here. You don't always have a tab for source docs, but we have to have source docs for all the entries that we put in the case report forms, right? So where do you maintain a lot of the source docs, or where are the source docs maintained?
We do ours in the subject binder, and like for the first visit, we put all the subject, like for my particular one, that I have like visit 1 and everything related to visit 1 is in that spot, and then visit 2, everything's related to visit 2.
Okay, perfect. Do your sponsors or your monitors ask for it to be like an official like copy or whatever of the source docs, like if it's something from the medical record, or?
He wants it signed. He wants it signed. Like that's my particular monitor. He wants everything signed and
By the
like
PI or by?
some of the stuff by the PI, some of the stuff by the coordinator. It just depends on what it
Okay.
is.
Anybody else have anything different? So, I mean, source docs can come from a lot of different areas. It can come from, you know, patient and medical records or the research records, because sometimes it might be something that it's a questionnaire and you know, directly get it from that subject or whatever. And sometimes we can even keep source docs like for small participants, like in the regulatory binder, but that gets a little dicey, just like we were talking about the case report forms, if it had like demographics and things like that in it. But that's perfect the way you set that up. I mean, that's a monitor should like that because it's organized by visits, things like that. Everything that you can do like more like that gets it organized, the better you're going to be with your monitor, your auditor. And also the thing is, we have to remember is I had a study that closed, and 10 years later they came into audit. FDA came into audit because it was a hormone replacement therapy, and that particular sponsor, it was White Earth, and they sold to Lilly or somebody, and Lilly wanted to take that drug to market. So they came in 10 years after we closed this study. And I got called in because I still was within the organization, but I was way for different jobs. But it's like, if we didn't have good source docs and good documentation, I couldn't have put together the story of that study at all. And so that's part of what you want it, not just for you to be able to tell what happened in that study, but for somebody else down the road to be able to come in and be able to know what happened on that visit or that with that subject or whatever the case may be. So I think for me, one of the most important things is documentation, like when we're conducting clinical trials. And we all know that because of the ungodly amount of documents that we have to keep up with. So just briefly, we'll talk about investigational product. If you have a study that has an investigational product, whether it's a drug, device, whatever the case may be, you've got to keep up with all the information, like the investigational brochure, the package insert, device manual, whatever, all versions. You also, lots of times they come with a sample of product labels, so you want to keep that in your regulatory binder. You also have to keep up with like shipment, receipt, dispensing, return, disposal, those kind of things. Making sure that you include dates, quantities, batch, serial numbers, whatever that IP comes with, you've got to keep up with all that kind of stuff. If you have a randomized trial, you have to keep up with instructions on how to unblind that subject if something happens. And also you have to keep up with the randomization schedule. And which a lot of times that's electronic through your IVRS systems or something like that. Other documents to maintain, like if you have a device or IP or a drug, then you have to keep up with the temperature log, storage maintenance instructions, things like that. Anything else with IP that y'all maintain that I didn't cover?
But the information on the IP can be kept like if there's a pharmacy dedicated to research, that information can be kept there. Do you have to have a note to file in the reg binder that says that information is?
Yeah, anything, any of these tabs that we've talked about, most of these tabs that we've talked about, if you don't keep it in that main regulatory binder, just have a tab for it, put your little note to file, say where it's being maintained, and you're 100% covered. And then that way, when, say, if something did happen and 4 years down the road, you're gone, somebody else comes in and they're looking for the temperature log or they're looking for whatever, then they can directly go, or the device manual or whatever the case may be, they can directly go and say, oh, it's in pharmacy and this is who's in charge of it or whatever. The other thing is we have lots of times on a lot of our studies, we do have lab procedures or testing centers procedures like mammograms or DEXA scans or different things like that. So we need to maintain some documents to show that that laboratory or that testing center is qualified to do those procedures for us. And so you also need like laboratory normal reference ranges or values for procedures. Even sometimes, like for certain procedures, that the sponsors might even ask you to get a certification of analysis or reliability for certain tests, of how certain tests are performed at that particular lab. But that's very specific to your study. But those are some things that sometimes they might ask you. Also, like whoever's in charge of that lab or that testing center, you need to collect their CV or their license or whatever for like and update it every 2 years as far as their participation in the study. Again, goes back to that qualified by experience training or that we need to show that they're qualified to do the job that we're asking them to do. Another thing is some studies we have, like we collect specimens, whether it's blood or it's tissue or whatever the case may be. So you might have like a tracking log to show like when those samples were taken, where they're being stored, what the temperature is, if we're shipping them off to someplace else, like batching them and shipping them out to someone, a different lab or whatever to do testing, you need to maintain all those documents to show where that specimen was from the time it was collected to the time that it's not at our site anymore and in between. All right, quickly, adverse events, SAEs, or like the purpose is we want to show that if anything unexpected or any side effects occurred to our subjects while they were participating in the study. And some of these things like the adverse events, you might just keep a log like in the subject binder, but then you might have a different log for like serious or unexpected adverse events. You might have a log for the study. Other things that go along, especially if it's a serious adverse event or an unexpected adverse event that needs to be reportable to the IRB or to the sponsor. You might have a CAPA that goes with it. You also want correspondence, like showing that you've talked to the sponsor about it. Correspondence if it's something that needs to be reportable to the IRB. Also, part of this is like if you have a sponsor trial where you have those I&D safety reports, you want to maintain those. One thing, a long time ago, we had to report all those I&D safety reports to the IRB. Now we don't, unless it meets those 3 criteria. So if your sponsor is still sending those, you might keep that in a separate binder, or some sponsors are still asking you to send them to the IRB. So you just need to maintain it however it's the easiest. I know one study I had 3 3-inch binders full of just I&D safety reports. So we would make logs of when we received it, when we sent it to the IRB, things like that, so we could keep up with it.
I have one with starting at 5.
Oh goodness gracious, you beat me. So you really on something like that, you really have to get organized to keep up with it. So when your auditor, your monitor comes in, they can look at their number, I&D, whatever, and say, oh, okay, I see when it got to you, you had so many days to send it to the IRB, and you send it to the IRB, and then you got a record of the IRB's response or whatever. Because most of the time on the I&D safety reports, our IRB here at UT will just give you that, yes, we received it, unless it's something, major. They really don't act on those, but they just want to know that you're reporting those. Because it's really more like the DSMB or whatever for that particular trial to look overall at the study to see if it's something that the city needs to close or whatever, or stop or whatever, because so many people are having some of the same issues. Protocol deviations, just document non-compliance with the protocol. So you might have a protocol deviation log for the study. Again, depending on what the deviation was, you might need retraining, you might need a corrective action plan. It just depends. You might just need a memo. Say a parent or a patient missed initialing a page of the informed consent. That might just require a memo. And so what we would do on that is the memo would say, yes, I was aware of this information on the day that we signed the informed consent. It was just inadvertently, missed or whatever. That might not require a whole bunch of stuff. But say, somebody missed like a whole 5 or 6 pages and, and they did it consistently, whoever was consenting them did it consistently, then that's going to be a retraining, a CAPA, a lot of other things to resolve that issue. And you want to, on the protocol deviations, you want to record the events as soon as possible so you don't forget exactly what happened. And you also want to try to correct those events as soon as possible. So that you don't keep having the same problems occurring. Because the IRB auditors, monitors frown on repeat mistakes and problems. We're all human, we're all going to make mistakes. But if we keep making the same ones over and over and over again, that shows an issue and it needs to be corrected. So we're almost to the end. Thank y'all for hanging in with me. Monitoring visits. You're on the monitoring visits, you're going to document that the visit actually occurred, who was there, the visit type, and also in this section you might put the results of your visits, your findings like your monitoring reports, things like that. Any correspondence with the monitor, any issues that they're asking you to do retraining, things like that. You want to put that in there and put your response to them. Also in monitoring visits, and I know this happened with a couple of people or one person in this room, like also make sure if you do have a sponsored trial, you read your monitoring report, because again, we're all human, we make mistakes, and sometimes our monitoring letters come back with mistakes. And if they do, you ask them for a corrected version, because you don't want that information being wrong and being in your binder. You want to ask them, because like if they say they couldn't find a document and it was there and you showed it to them or whatever, then you need to get them to correct that information and send you a corrected letter. And most of them are very willing to do that. Another section is the correspondence. So if you have specific correspondence or significant correspondence, like with the sponsor, the CROs, your monitor could be in the other section, or IRB, if there's something you don't want to keep in that IRB section, you just want to keep it in this correspondence. Maybe it's not anything directly related to the study, it's sort of a general question or answer, or correspondence with the study team about different things. This is a section that you can put those kind of documentation in. A lot of our sponsored trials, our correspondence, we would keep in a separate binder because it would be so large. But if your correspondence specifically about an individual subject, you might want to keep that more in the subject's research records, because it's probably going to maybe have some identifying information or specifics, so you want to keep that a little bit separate than in your rate binder. Legal financial documents. Where do y'all usually maintain these documents? Within the reg binder or separate?
Separate, typically.
Separate, exactly. Because you don't want auditors and monitors, FDA, whoever, NIH, to come in and see like your budgets and your contracts and things like that. See, most of the time, most people keep those outside of the reg binder. Again, just tell them in the tab where you're maintaining them, who's maintaining them. So some of those documents are like your FDA documents, like your 1572, 1571, those kind of things. Your contracts, budgets, subject payments might be kept separate if you're paying patients. Your confidentiality agreement, your material transfer agreement, like your contracts, things like that with the sponsor, the CRO, or your institutional type of contracts. Note to files. Tell me a little bit what you think about note to files.
Well, my monitor that I just recently had, I was told, do a note to file. If there's a problem, put it in there so that you know. Then he's like, well, note to files are bad. Don't do note to files because note to files are bad and they flag an issue. So you need to call it like a progress note or a memo or something like that.
Right.
Unless it really is truly like a big issue, then it needs to be a note to file.
A note to file is a note to file, no matter what you call it, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's what I.
But you're right. FDA came out several years ago that they frowned upon note to files. So now most people do call them more like memos or whatever. But note to files help us to understand what happened in a certain situation. It gives clarification, just like what I was saying. Say the parent misinitialing one page of the ICF. You do a note to file or memo, whatever you want to call it, and you explain what happened and explain that even though they missed that page on that particular day, they were aware of that information or whatever. And then I would get the patient, the parent, the next time they came in to initial that page, sign and date the date that they initialed it. And I'd also get them to initial and sign my note to file or my memo showing that they agreed with what I said, that they were aware of that information. So it just gives clarification to something that happened that was probably deemed a protocol deviation, but it's not a major protocol deviation to where you have to submit it to the IRB or something like that. And especially if, say, the initial page that got missed was risk to the subject or potential risk, you really want to clarify that that parent, that subject, whatever, was really aware of that information on the day that they signed that consent. So some pages are, I might not should say this, but some pages in the ICF might be a little more important than others, like your risk, things like that. So you really want to document if some of those things happen. So what's the purpose? I think we've covered most of that. And what it should include, when you do write a note to file or a memo, you want the signature of the author, the date it was created, and depending on what you're writing it about, the PI might even need to sign, just to say that they're aware, or put in there the PI was aware on this particular date or something. And you want a description, like we talked about, of who, what, when, where, how, whatever, why it happened, if you know why it happened, or an actions taken to resolve it. Depending on the infraction, you might need a corrective action plan. It might just, be a one-time thing. You just need to write that memo and be done with it. You want just to include the pertinent information to clarify that event. You don't want to put you don't want to write a book about it. You just want to put the bare facts about what happened.
I have a monitor that did not want them typed. And what are your feelings on that?
I always typed mine.
I know that,
But I signed and dated.
That's
I signed
better,
and
yeah.
dated them saying that I was the one.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, again, you got to keep your monitors happy. So if that's the way, they probably wanted it that way because it ensured that, or assured
Because
that
it
you were
looks
the
so
one.
formal, is what it was.
Yeah. Or that you were the one that was writing the actual note or memo or whatever. I probably would ask for clarification on why they needed it like that, because our policy or our practice was not to do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And there are monitors that are going to tell you certain things. And if you know for sure you don't need to do it, or it's really against your institutional or your departmental practice, ask them to show you the ICHGCP or the federal reg that tells them you need to do it that way.
Right.
They can't, probably, more likely. So it's just a preference. But I would do it like that because that's the way they want it and it makes them happy. So if something else comes down the road, then they might be a little more forgiving because you accommodated them in some other way, maybe. But basically, we're finished, and thank you so much for coming and mulling through all this. It's a lot of information. But again, let's just reiterate, we need to keep the regulatory binder up to date at all times, organized in a logical manner. Maybe it's the way our monitor wants it, our auditor wants it, maybe it's the way you want it so you can find things. You want it located in a central location, but only accessible to the appropriate study team members. And it can be maintained in paper, electronic, or combination of all these, as long as you can go and retrieve it when you need to. The last thing I will add to this though is just make sure that when your study is finished, you close out your study, that all the documents that you maintain, whether it's electronic or what, are stored with that study. So just maintain all these things so that you can go back and get all those documents you need to store. All right. Any questions? Any comments? Anything I missed? Anything?
I have a question just in general about email. So like with your email, with your correspondence, say your monitor, you email back and forth individual questions. You print out every single email and put it in the binder.
What most industry sponsors significant?
So not just general question, or if it's a general question that's related to the whole study, maybe.
Like,
if
no,
it's-
can you send me a form? I don't.
Yeah.
Right, no,
But if
yeah,
there's a
of course,
problem
that's
that I'm
what-
talking to
right.
them about, I'll.
Right, exactly.
And that's what I thought. I just want to clarify, like, as far as emails, like really what all do they want in there?
They say significant, so it's up to you to decide, you know,
If
but
it's significant. If it's significant enough that it took 3 or 4 threads to figure out the question. it's
just
always
keep the
been in
last
there.
one that has everything in it,
Yeah.
so you know. But the other thing, talking about the one study where I kept stuff on floppy disks, I would keep, like for each study, I would keep like a folder in my email for everything. And then at the end of the I would only print out what I thought was significant. And then at the end of the study, I would just take my email and put it over on, now we put it on a zip or whatever, thumb drive, whatever you want to call it, and just put all of it over there. So you have every single thing if you wanted to do it that way and store it. But I would only print out what I thought was significant.
And then on the ECRS, that's my other question. I just made one note right here. But the ECRS, you know, you said you put the blank copies with the regulatory binders. Well, most of them have gone to the ECRS now. So we have our source documents, but we're not submitting the source documents to the IRB. We just do the ECRS. So do they, like, how do y'all check that when it's electronic ECRS versus?
They're
paper?
supposed to send you a copy of the ECRS. You ask them
blank
for a
one.
printout. Yeah, you ask them for a printout.
Okay, because yeah, I was wondering.
Some don't like to do that, so
Yeah.
you might have a little pushback.
Yeah,
with
and I
it.
think that we've gotten them, but they're
Yeah.
like tiny that you see them, and then yeah.
Well, and that depends on, I mean, you know, the IRB, if they're asking for it, then they 100% gotta send it to you. But I really think.
So that would be something that's kind of individually on each study, is whether the IRB requires it.
Probably. I want to say, I don't want to misquote, but I'll look it up and I can go look it up. But I think it's in the ICH-GCPs in that section 8, where it talks about the essential docs. Go back and look at that. But I think one of the essential docs is a blank copy of your case report forms.
It seems like you discussed that in that presentation.
I think, yeah, I think it is. So if it is, then they're supposed to be going, most of your sponsors are going to go by ICH-GCPs. And so they shouldn't have a problem with it. So you might can quote that for them, you know, to them, that they have to provide that. But I know we have in the past gotten pushback from that too, because we've asked for it. Because one of the things is we would create what I call a site source doc for like things that you know that you needed for your case report forms, that documents, data that they wanted to collect, but it wasn't necessarily collected like as a routine of clinical stuff that your doctor or you did, you know. So there would be some things in there that's not in your protocol, but they wanted to collect, and you didn't document it anywhere else. And then when you went in to start your first EDC, your data collection, or you're filling out your stuff, it was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know to collect this information. So that's why we started asking for the electronic ones, because it would be some things in there that we needed to let the doctor know he needed to collect on the front end or whatever. So that we had that a couple of times, and that's when we started doing that. But anyway, all right. Got some people left, but all right, Molly. Yep. All right, thank you all that are online. Thank you very much.
They usually, you're right, they came on a CD, and it's so funny because none of our modems have CD. Any place to put a CD down. And somebody sent me their in this device study, but they sent me their amendment on CD. And like, can you do this? I'm like, well,
We have a couple
I could.
prizes not yet leave quite yet.
If I had a CD-ROM drive.
We have CTSI pins. They really work pretty well
Thank
too.
you.
Thank y'all.